alas, I don't have the background for our computer, but I'll
Well,
get one before next
teach
time.
Kadesh to your new computer.
Thank you. I hope so. So uh we jump into our Torah. We have the opportunity to study the Torah for Parashat Teitzei, which is comes from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah 54. It is a Haftorah that is well bred. Not the Haftorah we read the most over the course of the year. That is Haftorah for fast days, but it is a beloved Haftorah in that we read it many times. We read part of it now. We've read part of it already. The second half of it is Parshat Re'eh, which we read as part of the Shiva Nechemtas, part of the seven Haftorah of consolation. And if you take Parshat Re'eh and Parshat Ki Teitzei and you put it together, you get the Haftorah for Parshat Noach. So that is where this Haftorah comes from. It is 54, the first 10 verses, and then the end of the chapter and the next 5 verses of the next chapter form a unit that is, on the one hand, can be split, has a subunit in it. On the other hand, there are themes that tie one to the other, that connect them both in terms of language, in terms of content, and in terms of rhetorical style, which makes the Haftorah sort of a unit in and of itself, and is very typical for Yeshayahu, for Isaiah, to use many of these different pieces. And that, of course, there are themes that get pulled out that reflect the Haftorah and the story of Parshat Noach. And there are themes that get pulled out that reflect the unique attitude that we want to have when we think about Parshat Re'eh. And then there are themes that we pull out that are also part of this that reflect the unique connection to Parshat Ki Teitzei. So all of that is squished into what is one of the shorter Haftorah that we read of the year, besides for its popularity, and that's only 10 verses. We only read the first 10 verses in this Haftorah. The Haftorah begins as part on the heels of a broader dialogue that we've been having both in the book and then a separate dialogue that we've watched unfold over the last many weeks since Tisha B'Av that get us to Yom Kippur and to Rosh Hashanah. And this is typically referred to as the Shiva Nechemtas, the seven Haftarot of consolation. If you recall, as we talk about every year, Haftorah comes to reflect, echo, foil, give commentary on the Parsha. Sometimes Haftorah is replaced by the latest reading that we have. So let's say you have a Parsha and you have a special maftir. We always read the Haftorah that's connected to the special maftir. And every once in a while, even though we don't read something different, the calendrical cycle of the year, something that's happening in the calendar, impacts what we read, and we change the Haftorah for that. The Shiva Nechemtas is an example of that. The three Haftorot that we read before Tisha B'Av, the Shlosha de Peranuta, the three Haftarot of destruction, reflect that. And I think most commonly, the Haftorah was called Machar Chodesh, the Haftorah that we read on the day before Rosh Chodesh. There's nothing different on that Shabbos, right? It's no different than the Shabbos, a regular Shabbos B'Vorachim, but because of the proximity to Rosh Chodesh, our Haftorah adjusts to reflect the ebb and flow of the Jewish calendar, which I think is perhaps one of the most interesting, fascinating features. You know, it's one thing when the reading is different, but here is just the cycle of the calendar that changes that. And part of the discussion that you have in and out of the Shem Nechemtas is this dialogue between God and the Jewish people, Knesset Israel, between God and Yerushalayim, between different anthropomorphized objects that represent different aspects of the Jewish people. And over the course of the seven Haftorah of consolation, you can trace out different levels of discussion, of dialogue, of consolation. There's immediate consolation, there's long-term consolation, there's things might be good right now. How do I know they're going to stay that way? Assurances of a continued redemptive spirit, right? There's so many different pieces of consolation, and we trace out some of those. Our Haftarah comes in the middle of that. We're sort of towards the end. We have refined a number of forms of consolation. We're no longer Nachmu, Nachmu, Ami, right? That first sort of visceral comfort, desire to be present, to help, to give sort of nechama to the suffering people. We've evolved way beyond that. Now we're talking about what does redemption look like? How do we know that that's going to continue? What does the different metaphors of the trauma that that the Jewish people undergo get changed? I actually had a fascinating insight this year on this Haftarah, which I'm excited to share with you. The Haftarah begins, Rani Akara Lo Yalada, oh, shout, oh, infertile one, right? The Akara, the barren woman, this image of a barren mother not being able to bear children is a common one. Even just that image is somewhat of an oxymoron, right? We talk about barren mothers, right? Barren mothers are, by definition, an oxymoron. Either you're barren or you're a mother, right? But that is part of this inherent challenge here that the Jewish people describe, in that they're ascribing these feelings, but there is this future, there is the children, and that's what they're referring to. Because all your children will come back. Harchivi makom olech, enlarge the site of your tent. Meaning, enlarge Yerushalayim, enlarge the dwelling, enlarge everything that's going on, lengthen the ropes, extend the pegs. There's this extended metaphor to highlight not just the return, but the magnitude of the turn, the great ingathering that comes up. Kiyamin usmo tifrotzi. This language should be familiar to us because it's borrowed from here and makes it into our tefillah, into our davening, into l'chadodi. That your offspring will come from all over, and they will return to the destroyed cities, and they will all gather in Yerushalayim, right? And this is a beautiful prophecy of redemption. It's a beautiful prophecy that highlights a return. In previous years, we've noted that when previous notes, we've noted the unique interpretive style of some of the commentaries, in particular, a difference between maybe like the Ramban or the Rambam Maimonides as opposed to the Malbim, in that when we look at these metaphors, right, Harchivi Makom Aholech, enlarge the site of your tent, and then we see Yiriot Mishkano Tayech, the extend the Yiriot, the pillars, the poles of your Mishkan. So is that just like prose, right? We're speaking in poetic language, which is typical in biblical language, right? This sort of pairs. That is typical biblical language. That's typical biblical poetry. And the Ramban, Maimonides, Nachmanides will tell you it's all the same metaphor. It's all the same simile. It's all the same image. It means that the boundaries are going to grow. Why that's significant, we'll come back to in a second. And that people are going to come back. There are going to be so many people there. That's one thing. On the other hand, you have people like the Malbim who ascribe to a interpretive style called what I'll call omnisignificance. I don't call it that, but there are I didn't coin that term. That is a term used in the field of Parshanut, which highlights the idea that every word that's used isn't just forwarding the metaphor, that the Torah doesn't use or doesn't just use extra flowery language, but there are indications or interpretive structures that are brought here. So, for example, the Malbim will point out, Oholayich means the tent of Yerushalayim, and the Mishkan refers to Arei Yehuda, meaning the general location of the Judean, of the settled area of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, that there's this constant growth, there's a development, that there will be continual construction. In the next verse, where we see, verse 4, we see, and we say this in davening, right? Don't worry, lo telvoshi. Don't be embarrassed, and don't be valtiklomi. Don't be ashamed. So what's the difference between don't be embarrassed, don't be ashamed, don't be disgraced? So you could just say it's part of the language, right? That's how you speak. You're trying to calm someone, you're trying to provide consolation, nechama, right? And that's what we say. On the other hand, the Malbim will say busha means in this context embarrass yourself, meaning don't worry, you won't be embarrassed. What does that mean? You won't embarrass yourself. And klima is shame, which means for the Malbim, others won't shame you, right? There are two fears here. On the one hand, maybe people will all come back and we're going to embarrass ourselves. We're not going to be able to do it. Don't worry, that's not going to happen. Or we're all going to come back and we will be embarrassed by other people, and therefore don't worry about that either. Meaning the Malbim takes each of these words and ascribes unique meaning that it's additive to the story, whereas the Rambam, in many places, I don't think he says it here, but Maimonides cites this in the more Nevuchim and other places, particularly when he's talking about some of the extended metaphors in Tubim in the writing. So, for example, like Shir Hashirim. So Rambam will say, it's all one metaphor. It's about a relationship between God and the Jewish people. Maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. But when they're talking about this type of spice and that type of spice and this animal and that your face looks like an apple and your eyes look like a dove and you're this and you're that and all these different things, the Rambam is saying there isn't unique significance to that. That's just part of the metaphor that is being presented here. The Malbim ascribes this omni significance, and therefore we'll see each one of these. So as we just said that, but I want to highlight another part, verse number 2. What is so significant about this idea of elongating the city, elongating the space, making more space, right? There are lots of ways to communicate growth, right? You have a lot of people, you have to build new cities. I'm struck, this year, I'm struck by this language over here, of specifically a consolation that you'll have to extend the boundaries of your cities, as opposed to making new cities, right? As opposed to just saying you have a lot of people, you have to build more houses. What's this idea that you have to elongate the city gates? So anyone want to share their thoughts before I share mine?
I don't know. In the next pasuk, he talks about spreading out, because there will be more of you.
Right, exactly.
Right, but in Bet, he's talking about the physical space.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
There's actually Yishai Ribo. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a very popular Israeli singer right now. He has a song that uses some of these words. So let me give my interpretation. Who's hearing this prophecy? Where does this happen? General strokes. It's in Israel. Speaking to the northern or southern kingdom?
Southern.
Right? The northern kingdom's long gone. This is what period? What period?
After the first Churban.
After or during? I mean, this is towards the end of the first temple, right? Right? Yeshayahu is after the Churban. Yeshayahu is the end of is before Churban. But the tailspin down to the Churban, right? We are end of first temple period. Okay, what's happening in Yerushalayim? What's happening in Yerushalayim right now? Besides for all the corruption that Yeshayahu is talking about, Yirmiyahu talks about, Yecheskel talks about, there are refugees from all across Arei Yehuda that have come to Jerusalem. There are the northern tribes, some of them have fled to around Jerusalem, right? So much so that Chizkiyahu has to break the city, break some of these outer neighborhoods, and build what's called the Broad Wall, right? You can actually go see it today. It's in the old city. it's not like a tier one tourist stop in the old city. I don't know why. It's probably one of the coolest archaeological finds that exist. You can go see it today, and the and we know about it from the Navi. The Navi tells us that they did this. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen with you. You can see it over here. It's this broad wall. It's right over here. It's right by the playground in the Rova in the old city. And as he notes, Yeshayahu over here, he tells that he's upset. The prophet's upset that they broke down the wall to they broke down houses to build the wall. You can actually see the houses. You can see the houses broken in this broad wall. It goes, let's see where this map is, what to do, and let's see. So, whatever, it's not a great map for this. The truth is, what you see over here as this broad wall, I'm going to try to bring up a better picture. So figure it here. So over here is Har Bayit. Over here is Yerushalayim, Ir David, not the old city, right? This part over here is the walls, the Ottoman walls, which were built in the 1500s. And eventually the city grows onto this slope right over here. This is where like Yeshivat HaKotel is, where the stairs are. There's actually a valley over here that over time got filled in because of debris that fills in, a valley that separates like the upper city of Jerusalem and Har Bayit. And so you have over here. And then eventually people start building houses all over here, right? And the city grows. The city grows westward. This is the west, right? Over here would be the western wall, is the Kotel. The city grows westward. And so they're worried that people are coming. They need to fortify the city. So they break down this is another picture of it. They break down their houses on both sides. They break down and they build this huge wall. It's this massive wall. The truth is, if you go today, none of that is as visible because they actually built it now as a tourist site. And you can go down toward the broad wall. It's not open yet. It will be open come January, I believe, or the Chagim. I actually had the opportunity to take a private tour of it and watch. They have a video that's still in production that they made, which is fascinating. But part of the image or the trauma of the exile, of what they went through, is this idea of this contraction of Yerushalayim, of this needing to break down houses, of not having enough space, of recognizing that as the city grew, that was a liability, right? And part of what your Yeshayahu is hearing is saying about this, and Yeshayahu is the prophet who castigates the king for building this wall, for constricting the walls of Yerushalayim. So now when Yeshayahu turns around and says, what will the future be? The future will mean that will be, and by the way, the king, the king who he attacks for this is actually a good king. It's Chizkiyahu, right? Chizkiyahu does this. Chizkiyahu is a good king. And you can imagine the prophet's telling him not to do this, but he knows the armies are coming. He knows that there are people who are outside the wall who need to be fortified. What do you do in that situation? You don't have a choice. You got to build a wall to protect the people, and you got to bring people in, and the city becomes crowded and challenged, right? And this is a story that continues throughout Jewish history. We're just blessed to be in the first or second generation that doesn't live with that, right? The idea that settlements in Israel, that communities in Europe were built in a way that they were narrow, that they had sort of the houses built walls that sort of self-contained to keep people safe, is a continuing idea that you couldn't just sprawl out across the neighborhood. There was a safety in the way you lived your life, in the way you situated your living arrangements. So this promise of being able to extend the walls, to be able to, make more room, knock down the walls. We got to build more space because more people are coming and redemption is coming, and to be able to welcome everyone is such a change from what the Jew who's listening to this at that time, right? They're saying, what do you mean? Redemption is going to mean that when we have all that, instead of refugees cramming in to a smaller city, redemption is going to mean that we're all going to come back. We're able to expand. We're able to build. You can only imagine, again, Yeshayahu, this is being read in Yerushalayim. Imagine the person hearing this as they walk through the houses that have been broken to build the broad wall. It's unbelievable to think about. And that's this promise that becomes a centerpiece of the redemptive story that Yeshayahu tells.
Rabbi, it's interesting to me in Pasuk Aleph that he addresses this. I assume this is to Yerushalayim, or to the barren woman who has never been able to give birth. And now there's going to be tremendous expansion and huge numbers of people coming in.
Yeah, and by the way, Rashi says explicitly that, Rihanna. Rashi says, Rani Akara, who is Akara? Yerushalayim.
Yerushalayim, yeah.
Right? Exactly that. Asher lo haita kelo yalda. That was like that she wasn't able to give birth. Meaning, and by the way, I think that's even part of this metaphor of giving birth or not being able to give birth, right? Of being this, if we look at it through the lens of being constricted, of not having space to expand, right? It's such a powerful image. Particularly, you think about a woman who's, I've only watched it 3 times now, but when you're at the end and you want to give birth, right? Being constricted and not being able to is also very painful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's go on to just a couple more things because it's let's just look at the last 2 lines. This is part of what is the signature of this Haftarah. Ki mei Noach zot li. This is like the mei Noach, right? So what exactly is this? What this language is? There is a question about whether it's like the waters of Noach or ki yemei, right? Is that first word 2 words or 1 word? And it's a debate. The Minchas Shai quotes both of them. And part of this fits with the broader theme of the chapter of sort of a water metaphors and imagery that follows through. The next Haftarah, that is the next line, reflects the Haftarah of Re'eh, which is Ani Asora, which is this afflicted, storm-tossed person, which is a pun also on the Hebrew word for boat, which is an onia. So a afflicted, a storm-tossed boat, but really an afflicted person is what's being said. But what's the what?
In the art scroll, ki mei is hyphenated.
Right, and that could be
them, because if ki means because, then there would be a pause after the word ki.
Well, either way, it's hyphenated because sometimes you have that connection. That's partly the way you read the verse because the ki doesn't have its own trup, but it's either ki mei, like the days of Noach, or like the waters of Noach. Either way, it actually doesn't change much the meaning. Zot li asher nishpati ma'avor me Noach od al haaretz, that God promised not to have any more water on the land. Ki ke nishpati. So too, God promises, and this is a much broader form of consolation. This is like a 3rd tier consolation, right? We've already talked about, that things are going to get better, this and that. Once things start to get better, you start wondering, well, can I fall back into that? Can that happen again? So this is the consolation that won't happen, right? That God won't do that. That ultimately there will be a redemption. Keharim Yamushu, even if the mountains move, the go and the lower mountains, the hills, might tremble. The chasti miitech, but my covenant, my loyalty, my chesed to you will never lo yamush, will never change. Ubrit shlomi, and my covenant of either peace or friendship or fellowship, lo tamut, will not move. Right, using the same lines that we used a second ago for even if the mountains will falter and the hills will shake, my covenant won't falter and my chesed won't shake. So says Hashem. Right? This is how the Haftarah ends. And it's, of course, we read this when we come to Parashat Noach, but there's an interesting piece to sort of point out about this, in that Parashat Noach, we're told about the vision of the kashet, of the rainbow, and this promise, right? What's he referring to? The promise that God won't ever destroy the land, right? It's a brit, it's a covenant. What's interesting is there really a covenant? What normally do you need to do for a covenant? Someone needs to do something, and then someone else does something, right? Brit Milah is a covenant. Brit Melach is a covenant. Brit Sinai is a covenant. Keep the mitzvot, and then X.
Mm-hmm.
The Brit of the Keshet, the covenant of the rainbow, isn't really a covenant, right? It's not that humanity needs to do anything. God's just promising not to do it again, right? God's just promising not to do it again. And even though it's structured that way, it actually is a very powerful image now for us to think about. Just like the brit of the keshet isn't really a brit, it's an oath that God promises us independently, unilaterally to do X. So too, part of the brit that we have with God that will bring redemption, that will be that relationship, there's an aspect of that Yeshayahu was highlighting here as part of this nechama. How do we know that this will happen? Because just like there was a brit that wasn't really a brit, it was an oath. So too, there's a brit that wasn't really a brit, that's an oath that God's going to make sure this happens, regardless of what happens. The main Noach, this reference to the situation of Noach highlights and heightens this commitment by God that's not dependent on us, right? Because that's inherently part of the challenge through all of this. Because there's a recognition that the Jewish people deserved what they're getting. And so therefore, how can you promise me a rosy future in the future? It's not up to God how I'm going to behave, right? Maybe we'll be bad again. And so part of what we see over here is exactly that. Is this covenant that isn't really a covenant. And it gets highlighted. And by the way, what's really interesting about that becomes we actually see, now that we fully understand it, we actually see somehow God's signature in Yeshayahu, in Yecheskel, as a rainbow. Part of when we talk about the image of God and the presence of God and the different pieces, particularly, for example, at the beginning of Yecheskel or in the Meiser Merkava of Yeshayahu, in both of those places, or in Yeshayahu's vision and Yecheskel's Meiser Merkava, the idea of the chariot. So we actually talk about there's this beautiful image of the rainbow in the clouds, in the tapestry of the vision of the Almighty. Right? We sing about it on Yom Kippur. Kidmut hakeshet b'toch anan. That's an image that we pull from the prophets who are seeing that when they encounter God. And while we don't fully understand, like, what does that mean? God looks like a rainbow, right? Part of that means it's sort of God's personal signature on God's word when it comes to the flood. So we see that here as well, that this promise isn't just like, if you do X, we'll do Y. It's not a brit. It's an oath. It's a covenant. I'm sorry. It's a promise. And that, that becomes a very powerful redemptive undertone here as well. that gets highlighted. What else do we want to look at? And some of the other part, just to highlight, some of these kimei noachli, some of this language. Hold on. And the water imagery in both Mei Noach and Kimei Noach, both of those are the link, the hook to the second half of this Haftarah, not that we read this Shabbos, second half of this chapter, which also carries forth some of this both building imagery of building a larger space, of expanding and bedazzling and bejeweling the location, but also this water imagery that ties part one, which is our Haftarah, to part two, which is the Haftarah that we read, Parashat Re'eh, and the Haftarah that we read together for Parashat Noach. So that's sort of a link between that. Let's see, what else is there? I mean, there's a lot here also that we sort of skipped. Verse number 7, berega katod, in a moment, right? What does the article translate that as?
Well, but a brief moment.
A brief moment that I have, forsaken.
God had anger for us for a brief moment.
Yeah.
There's some who say, meaning there's some who say, for a brief moment I abandon you, uberachamim, and with great mercy and love I'll bring you back. Meaning God was only angry for a second. That passed. The shetzef katzef in a slight moment. Yeah. On the other hand, you have people who translate this in a different way. Let me just pull up one to. Others translate this as actually less of a consolation and more of a challenge, meaning God, what we've seen so far was just a smidget of God's anger, right? Which is not the most comforting. How that fits into the broader, how that fits into the broader theme of this chapter, let alone the Shivit and the Chemtas, is more when we study Yeshayahu together. But it's just two ways of sort of reading how you look at this. Is it berega katon in a split second of anger that passed, or you only got to see a split of God's anger, but there could be so much more there. It's an interesting question to think about. But
it's parallel though, that the structure of those two.
Right,
brief,
and that
moment and a slight wrath. I mean, it's
right. But what's a slight wrath mean? Meaning that it's just like a slight moment, or is it like that was it and then it's over? We don't know. All right. Why don't let's stop here, and we will. We'll continue next week. I wish everyone a good day. It's great to see you, and looking forward to continuing to study together.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care.